the show goes incredibly well. I'm sure it will. And to you, Dr. Renee, thank you very much indeed. Well, it's been a pleasure as always. Always lovely to have two doctors. Why have one when you can have two? Thank you very much to all of you for your company this morning and yesterday morning as well. I just want to finish with this. John in Lincolnshire says, very moving watching and listening to your two young niece and nephews. Weren't they so eloquent? It really gives one hope for the future. This is Talk TV. Lively debate, intelligent conversation. Join me, Dr. David Bull, on Talk TV every week.
As we bid farewell to our cherished monarch, join Talk TV to reflect on an extraordinary life of service and dedication.
And a very good morning to one and all. It is Sunday the 18th of September. It's just after 10 o'clock. I'm Richard Tice, and you're listening for the next 3 hours, hopefully, to Tice Talk, here on another historic day, historic weekend, because this is, of course, the last day before tomorrow's funeral of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. It's the last day of the lying in state, and tomorrow will be, as I just said just before the news, the funeral of all funerals. It'll be, I think, the commemoration of all commemoration. So we'll be talking about that. But there are many other issues that we need to talk about, and I hope that you'll be joining in with me looking at that. I've got some, believe it or not, yes, some climate good news. It's always good to have good news, isn't it? So we'll be sharing that with you later in the programme, in the second hour. We need to be talking about what's going on in Ukraine, some extraordinary shifts there in the war between Ukraine and Russia. Matters economic, it's important to look at. And then also what's going on in Sweden. Big shift there. These are really important issues that, in a sense, slightly been put to one side, but we need to start to focus on. We've got some great guests throughout the show, and my big questions for you, and I really want your input to make it a lively, interactive show. So what's been the best bit, or the saddest bit for you of this historic week? And what's your lasting memory of Her Majesty the Queen, of the Elizabethan era? And indeed, if you're queuing on this last 24 hours of the queue, it's less than 24 hours now, if you're queuing and listening, understandably, to Talk TV, give us a call. You know the number, 0344 499 1000, because we want to hear from you, to hear what's going on, what's the mood. As I say, those really important questions. How are you feeling after such a historic week? Are you looking forward to the commemoration and the funeral tomorrow, or will you be sadder than ever? Your input really matters. 0344 499 1000, or text us to 87222 using the word talk, or of course send us a tweet at Talk TV or at Tice Richard, and we will be getting to those throughout the show. Don't go anywhere, stay with us. Coming up, it is of course the Sunday Sermon. Well, you won't be surprised that this week I want to focus on celebrating a life well lived, a legacy well left, and lessons to be well learned from the extraordinary example set by Her Majesty the Queen. There are so many remarkable tributes from people all over the world, and of course tomorrow's funeral will probably be the most watched event ever in the world. And it does feel as though we are lucky to be witnessing a massive moment in history, the ending of one era, but actually with, I think, a certain enthusiasm towards the beginning of a new era under our new king. And I just wanted to say a few things about the Queen, and I wanted to pay my respects when I joined the queue on Wednesday, which was a remarkably humbling experience. I made some friends. The very first people I met in the queue were indeed other Talk TV listeners and viewers, and if they're listening this morning, a very, very good morning to you. We shared 5.5 hours together, and it really was just remarkable, friendly, lots of stories, why people wanted to be there, why people wanted to pay their respects to the late Her Majesty the Queen. It really is still, of course, it's the queue of queues for what I describe as the Queen of Queens, the monarch of all monarchs. And when you actually get finally to Westminster Hall, that historic hall, the lying in state, there's a silent calm, sombre, serene, reflective, thoughtful, many people tearful, deeply appreciative, lots of people bowing, curtsying. It really was truly British in every single possible respect. And I think there's an important thing to say, actually, which is a massive, massive thank you to all of those involved in enabling that lying in state. There are literally thousands of volunteers, cleaners, security guards, police, all of the staff in Westminster, the Palace of Westminster, who've come together, worked incredible hours, and it really has worked utterly seamlessly. That's everything I saw. And so just a huge thank you. It's very easy to sort of take it for granted, but the logistics of organising that. And you think about the lessons that we should learn from Her Majesty the Queen. I mean, there's so many, but if you look at her devotion to duty, and what I take from that is, if you've got a cause, if you've got a passion, if you've got a great interest or hobby, never give up. The Queen never, ever gave up. Her dedication, stick to your guns, keep at it. The Queen was never a quitter. And I think, that's the thing, is stick at it. Never quit in life. And also, the Queen's commitment to service. The lesson I learned there is, however tough it is, keep going. When the going gets tough, the tough get going. And that motto that the Queen had, never complain, never explain. And it reminds me of my mother, and one of the greatest lessons that she gave to me was, get on with it, son. Don't be so wet. Get a grip, just push on. And, I just think that's a really good attitude in life. There's always difficult moments, but actually, you've just got to push on through it. And certainly, when the Queen had challenges around her with her nation, that's what she did. But also, her sense of humour. And it really is important, humour, to try and find laughter whenever one can. Sometimes it's difficult, but actually, it's good for the soul, it's good for spirit, it's good for our relationships and our friendships. Just think how tolerant the Queen was over her 70-year reign. I mean, there must have been times when she woke up and thought, must I? But actually, she never did. In truth, she always just carried on. And, even when things were tough, she was tolerant, even when things were not going to plan. And her capacity for hard work, I mean, things don't just happen. In all our walks of life, you know that if you want something to happen, actually, you've got to work at it and make it happen. And actually, interestingly, we're seeing that already from King Charles. I mean, the work ethic that he is putting in recent days is extraordinary. And there's another key lesson I take from Her Majesty the Queen, which is preparation always pays off. It really, really does. And it seemed the Queen was always so well briefed. She able to speak to, when she was meeting people, she always knew who you were, something about you. And that's utterly remarkable. Her ability to listen to people, to listen to stories, to listen to briefings, and to show an interest. And of course, what she took from that was she never stopped learning throughout her life, even though when you think you know it all, but actually none of us do. You never do, because things change, things evolve. A bit like science, funnily enough, science evolves, but more of that later. And the other remarkable thing about the Queen was she was probably the politest person that any of us can ever think of. Was she the politest person in the world? And I think that's quite a really good lesson for us all, particularly amongst the rough and tumble of politics. I mean, why do people need to feel the need to be so rude? You may have seen on Twitter I experienced a bit of that earlier this week, and it's just not necessary. We can debate, we can discuss, but let's have a bit of civility about it. Now, I think King Charles III, of course, he will be a different style of monarch, and that's right. Don't try and copy other people. But he bears the same immense responsibility. I think actually all of us are very lucky to be seeing in the new Carolean era. And remarkable, just thinking then of young people, David Bull's niece and nephew, that's all they will really probably remember. A Carolean era, a king. Whereas, of course, we all remember a queen, and that's life moving on. And it's interesting to see the new king, how many walkabouts already he's doing, and I'll be speaking to Lance Foreman later about meeting the king in the queue yesterday. He's enjoying these walkabouts. He's being seen lots and lots, and that's a good thing. And I believe he will have the best wishes of a nation who wants and who treasures the stability of a monarchy amongst all of the slight madness and craziness and bluntly rudeness and instability of the world of politics. I think that the King has had a cracking start. And frankly, if Fountain Pen Gate is the only thing to go wrong, then all will bode very well indeed. And of course, tomorrow's funeral is a time of sadness, of reflection, but I think it's a time of commemoration of a truly splendid, amazing mother, not only of her family, deeply devoted to her, but also the mother of our nation. Truly an amazing monarch of all monarchs. And I would argue, truly the greatest ever Britain. And I'm optimistic that as a nation, we can come together, we can overcome the many challenges using lessons that we draw from the Queen's leadership. God save the King. Well, those are my thoughts and reflections on where we are at tomorrow's funeral, the lessons we should learn from the Queen. But of course, life moves on, the world moves on, and indeed there are some big issues out there. And in the world of the war between Russia and Ukraine, this has a massive impact on all our lives. But there's a big change and shift that's been going on literally in recent days that many people may have missed, because Ukraine has started to recapture territory that was previously taken by the Russians back at the beginning of the war. And I'm delighted now to be joined by Ben Hodges, the former commander of the US Army in Europe, to discuss this further, because it has massive ramifications. Ben, a very good morning to you. Thanks for joining me. You wrote a really, I thought, thoughtful article, Ben, in one of the papers, I think it was on Wednesday or Thursday, about the implications for what's going on in Ukraine. Ukraine recapturing huge swathes of territory, Ukrainian territory, and what this may mean within Russia itself, if Russia is really struggling to replace lost forces, lost equipment, lost tanks and ammunition. What may happen in Russia, the pressure on the Putin regime?
Richard, thank you. Well, you know, President Putin had a really bad week. The First Guards Tank Army destroyed. I mean, that's kind of the premier unit of the Russian Federation forces. He was humiliated by all of his friends in Samarkand, where he was kept waiting by heads of state, when usually it's been the opposite in the past. The 440 plus bodies that were exhumed there around Izium, so the whole world is reminded of who it is we're dealing with. And then, of course, the video which went viral of the Wagner group recruiting convicts to come fill the ranks of their forces. And then the Ferris wheel, which he had bragged about being taller than the London Eye, broke down on its first day. So, and then, of course, the United Nations General Assembly voted 101-7 against Russia's request to prevent President Zelensky from addressing the General Assembly by video. So that's just 1 week. The pressure is absolutely building on the Kremlin, and I think within the Kremlin, because of this catastrophe that's going on in Ukraine. Now, I think not only in Ukraine has the momentum shifted irreversibly, I would say, although it is too early to be planning victory celebrations, the momentum is irreversibly now with Ukraine. I believe that the Russian Federation forces will be pushed back to the 23 February line by the end of this year, and that Ukraine will have Crimea by the first half of next year.
So that's a remarkable thing, because I don't think anybody, possibly in people's wildest dreams, thought that Ukraine could actually take back Crimea. You think that this is irreversible. There may be setbacks, but this is a one-way ticket.
Yeah. We know from history that war is a test of will and it's a test of logistics. And Russia's logistics system has been getting weaker every week over the past couple of months, partly because sanctions are having effect, partly because their system was never designed to sustain land operations for an extended period of time outside of Russia, and partly because of the destruction of dozens and dozens of ammunition points, over 1,000 trucks and truck drivers gone, and they are having a difficult time. They're exhausted.
So in Russia itself, you wrote in your article that you felt that actually it could be destabilizing for parts of the Russian Federation, that regions such as Chechnya, might think about trying to break away.
Yeah. So, we were not prepared for the collapse of the Soviet Union. I mean, I think it caught most people by surprise. And a lot of it turned out well, a lot of it not well. And so as I've looked at what's happening around Russia now, really over the last couple of years, but especially now, it appears to me that we could be looking at the beginning of a collapse of the Russian Federation as we know it today. And I base that on the population issue that you just alluded to. Not a big population, actually, for Russia, but it's divided by about 120 different ethnic groups. And I think some of them may see opportunity because the Russian military has been exposed as not only totally corrupt, but also not that good.
And I mean, that in itself is just remarkable, because no one's really focused on that, the possibility of Russia starting almost to run out of troops. I mean, we sort of forget, don't we? I mean, Russia, I think it's about 70 times the land mass of the United Kingdom, but it's actually only about twice the population. So, about 140, 45 million people across a huge landmass. Actually harder to control than perhaps we might have sort of taken for granted.
Yeah, the Kremlin, or President Putin, has spent the last 20 years making sure that he is coup-proof. They have a fairly extensive National Guard, if you will, that's there to protect the regime. And of course, I think part of the reason that they have not called for a general mobilization to address the catastrophe in Ukraine and the manpower problems they have is because then it would demonstrate to the population that Putin is not actually in control, which is, of course, he wants to always convey he's in control. This would demonstrate that he's not, and it would give light to all the fairy tales that they've been pumping out here over the last couple of years about Ukraine.
And there could be huge dangers of a breakup of Russia itself in terms of who's then in charge of nuclear facilities and things.
Yeah, that would probably be the number one on my list of things for which we would have to prepare. And a lot of these potential breakaway republics will have learned the lesson from Ukraine: don't give up your nuclear weapons. Now, I don't know where all of Russia's thousands of nuclear weapons are stored or located or what condition they're in, but for sure, this would be, I think, every head of state and government would be concerned about that.
That is the main lesson to learn. Ben, thank you so much indeed. That's Ben Hodges, former Commander US Army Europe, with his thoughts about the implications within Russia, what's really going on in Russia with the shift in the war. Stay with us. Coming up after the break, we're going to be talking to Ross Clark, the columnist at the Daily Telegraph, about matters economic and energy. Don't go anywhere. You're listening this Sunday morning to Tice Talk here at Talk TV. Welcome back, my friends, to Tice Talk this Sunday morning. Lots of tweets and messages coming in. Some very supportive, but Julie's not so sure, actually. Richard, I disagree with your opinion that the Queen is the greatest ever British monarch. She had it very easy compared to most others. Well, that is one opinion. I'm not so sure, to be honest, Julie. And, you know, she's had 70 years of huge change, huge challenges, and challenges not only with the nation, but also within her own family. And I think she set an outstanding example. But that's the joy of having different opinions. We're going to have a quick call from Glasgow, where David's on the line, before we go to Ross Clark. David, morning.
Good morning, Richard. How are you today?
Yeah, fine. Thoughtful, but focused on other matters as well. What's on your mind, David?
Well, yes, I mean, it's a week today since the Queen was driven from Balmoral to Edinburgh.
Yes, that's right.
We had the privilege of going to Edinburgh to see the procession. Now, you know, the streets in Edinburgh are really quite narrow.
Yes.
So the intensity of that procession was really quite evident, you know. We then had the privilege of going into St Giles. Now, if people hadn't had the opportunity to go into St Giles before, so it's on one level. So when you come up the stairs at the door, you can literally see the Queen's coffin, you know, from the door. You know, so
it must have been very striking.
It's very striking, but you're there and you're outside and you can say, well, there it is, and that's kind of okay, you know. And then you do your respectful bit, and then you come out. And then we flew down on Tuesday to London, and we joined the queue in London about 3 p.m. on Thursday. And absolutely beautiful, you know, the whole queue right up to, I think, Victoria Gardens.
Well done. And how? And did you make some friends? How long did you queue for, David?
Yeah, well, I think it was about Friday, about 3 kind of 2 a.m., 3 p.m. This was a fascinating thing in the queue. You know, when you get your wristband?
Yes.
You know, we called on that we were kind of like safe in that sense, you know?
Exactly.
So that whole bit from the queue right up to Victoria Gardens, you know, that all the shops and the scenery of London, it was beautiful just at night time, just walking through and, you know, everything. And then you got to Victoria Gardens, obviously, and it's in there, and it's, you know, but you know, when you go through that security bit,
yes,
and then you go into the House of Parliament. Now, I've been in, well, several of us that were with us were in the House of Parliament, you know, for the tour. So we kind of knew the layout of the building. We weren't really sure where we were going. We were just directed. And then when you get to that bit where you're turning around the corner at the top of the stairs,
and there it is, the splendour of the hall.
And I just went, oh my, you know, it really just took my breath away, because that compared to St Giles, where you were prepared, you know, you could see it. And I just standing at the top of that stairs and looking down, I'm thinking, oh, this is... Do
you know, David, that's...
lose it at that point.
Yeah,
I really do.
That's exactly the feeling I had. It was just extraordinary. Well, David, you've been remarkable. So you've essentially sort of seen the Queen's coffin in 3 different places.
The fascinating thing is, as well, Richard, is just to finish on this. I think for this whole events, and probably the events that are going to happen until, you know, she's laid to rest, finally, I really think the Queen's sending out a message.
I agree with you. I agree with you.
Whether it's a spiritual message, a community message, there's something unique about this whole thing, you know?
David, you are so right. There is something unique that all of us can take from her legacy, her life, and her dedication. Great call, David from Glasgow, who saw the Queen coming out of Balmoral, and then at St Giles Cathedral, and then also at Westminster Hall. Thank you for that. Keep those calls coming in, 0344 499 1000. Now, patiently waiting on the line is Ross Clark, who is journalist for The Spectator and indeed the Daily Telegraph, and wanted to speak. Good morning, Ross. Just wanted to catch up with you because obviously life goes on. We have to start focusing on some of the other massive challenges that faces the country and the new government under the new Prime Minister. I mean, you sort of almost forget the gravity of the change that's going on. And you wrote a piece about in terms of sort of the what's happening to confidence in our economy and the impact on the pound and the inflation, which in a sense is important just to understand with everything else that's going on.
Yes, yeah, well, it would be easy to miss the news last week, the economic news. So the pound actually fell to its lowest level against the dollar since 1985, fell down to about $1.14. No, the euro has also been falling against the dollar. European currency is very weak, and it's not hard to work out the reasons for that. Is that European economies have been very struck by the energy crisis in Europe. Whether you're in the EU or outside the EU, you're very exposed to the loss of some Russian gas coming into the system, whereas the US is much more energy self-sufficient. On the positive side, we can say that the sinking pound is not always the bad news, which it is often held up to be. It's very easy to see the sort of value of the pound as a kind of national virility symbol, and when it falls, we feel bad about the economy. But I mean, if you go back to 1985 and look what happened then, of course, it was followed by the 1980s boom, which was a period of very strong economic growth.
So a weak pound is good for exports.
It's good for exports, but because it makes British-made goods and services look relatively cheap elsewhere in the world. But the downside, of course, is that it pushes up the costs of imports. And this is what worries me at the moment, because back in 1985, a very different economy in two senses. One, we were self-sufficient in energy then. The North Sea oil was flowing freely. We were also much more self-sufficient in food. At that time, about 80% of the food consumed in Britain was produced here, whereas now our food self-sufficiency is down to 60%, and of course we're importing about half our energy now. So, you think of these two basic things, food and energy. When the pound sinks, that means it causes inflation in energy. And
that is a key thing, and I'm so glad you've highlighted it like that, because being self-reliant on energy is so vital. And if we're importing lots of energy, and we know the price of energy is very high, and of course most of it is priced in dollars, so that is going to either increase inflation further or keep it at these high levels.
Yes, well, this is a sort of, this is extra inflation, as you like. I mean, all wholesale energy costs around the world are much higher than they were a couple of years ago. But if you factor in a sinking pound, that's a sort of extra cost, if you like. And so, when the energy spike in wholesale energy costs does subside, and it has subsided already for oil, and then gas, fell on Friday, we're still going to have this sort of extra inflation built into the system through the sinking pound, if you like. And it's a lesson that we've going to have to learn from this, the importance of energy security. And for years we've ignored it in Britain. We've sort of followed a net zero green policy. Let's just try and reduce carbon emissions. The sort of energy security hasn't come into it. With the result, we've allowed North Sea production to fall. We've failed to exploit our shale gas reserves.
Well, that's right. And you and I have spoken on energy matters before, Ross, and I think this is one of the key shifts. I mean, we're going to be hearing from the Chancellor later this week, I think Friday, with a sort of a fiscal statement. It's like a mini budget. But the big shift, of course, is the recognition under this new government that they want to lift the moratorium on shale gas. And that's going to be a whole new battleground, it seems to me, because, many of us, and I know millions of people in the north of England are delighted about that. But there are also many of the sort of what I call the eco-extremists who are not going to take it lying down. So it's a huge battleground ahead.
Well, it is going to be a huge battleground. I mean, that moratorium has already been lifted quietly last week. So what that means is it makes it practical for shale extraction to proceed. For the past 3 years, we've had this moratorium that sort of set an unrealistically low level for earth tremors. I mean, the fracking process does produce sort of very minor earth tremors. To call them earthquakes is completely ridiculous. These are tremors that, in most cases can't be felt by people standing on the surface of the earth. They don't.
That's right. It's like
damage or anything, but they're just measurable. And for the past 3 years, we've had this very unrealistic low level that's been set for that, which has made it basically impossible.
It's going to be a real test of this government's strength, though. It
will be, because as you say, the eco protesters, the Extinction Rebellion types, they're going to go into overdrive over this. Even before they were around, of course, we had these mass protests again, and I think the government's mistake in the mid 2010s was to basically to sort of wash its hands of the planning aspects of this, and the whole sort of decision of whether to frack or not to frack was sort of subcontracted to a bunch of local councillors in Lancashire.
Completely.
And I'm nothing against local councillors, but really they should not be making decisions which are of national importance.
That's the point, Ross. Energy security is a matter of national strategic importance and should be dealt with so. Ross, thank you so much for your thoughts there. That's Ross Clark, the journalist and writer for The Spectator and The Telegraph, who is a guru on so many different things to do with economics, but also energy. Thank you very much for that on Tice Talk. We've just got time before the break to take one call from Joy, who is in Nottingham. Hi, Joy.
Oh, good morning. Thank you for taking my call.
How are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Fine, thanks. How are you feeling? Are you ready for tomorrow's funeral? Are you sort of ready for moving on?
I think I'm ready to move on, but I have been keeping up to date with everything that's been going on, because I am a supporter of the Royals, and I think they've all been fantastic. They must be so exhausted.
Oh, they really must be. I mean, without question, because it has been just a just frenetic schedule that the King and all around him have adopted. I actually seriously thought, I said, who's looking after the King?
Yes, I know.
Because we need. I mean, he's doing a great job, but he needs time to rest and to grieve as well.
Yes, definitely. And the Queen Consort also. I mean, they're both in their 70s now and have done so much. And Princess Anne, of course.
That's right, and it's easy to forget that. The King is in his 70s, and in a sense he's been preparing for this moment, but the enormity of it.
Yes.
But do you think he's had a good start? Are you sort of...
Yes.
Are you happy and encouraged and enthused?
I'm very encouraged, actually. I mean, I think he's come a long way from the early days, and I think he's proving that he's going to be a man of the people, which is good, that his mother instilled in him. And I think that I hope God gives him a good few years to prove his worth as king. And yes, I'm very encouraged at the moment.
Fantastic. Well, I am too, Joy. Indeed. Thank you very much for that. That was Joy from Nottingham. She's encouraged. I'm encouraged. Let me know how you're feeling at the moment. 0344 499 1000. We've just got a tweet in here from Claire, who says, obviously thoughts with all of those loved ones throughout this period who've lost loved ones. It's so difficult. In a sense, quite understandably saying, you're hearing back-to-back mourning on the stations, but Claire will be, in a sense, although a royalist, glad when tomorrow's over, because she's lost her mum, and that's just making it that much harder. So really grateful for that tweet by Claire there. Stay with us. You're listening to Tice Talk this Sunday morning here at Talk TV. Welcome back, my friends, to Tice Talk here on Talk TV this Sunday morning. And, of course, we've been thinking about other matters over and above the lying in state of the Queen's coffin before tomorrow's funeral. Matters Ukraine, matters economic. Lots of tweets coming in. One here from, Romy, who says, could we have even a tiny hint of nuance in the coverage on Ukraine? If it's not Ukrainian MPs, it's commentators pushing a narrow Ukrainian propaganda. Yes, Putin must be condemned, but it's impossible to get an accurate picture. Well, look, I think the point is that no one's saying Ukraine didn't have challenges. No one's saying Ukraine was perfect, a model of democracy before the war. But it is a sovereign state. And, what Russia has done is truly, utterly awful. Firstly, of course, for Ukrainian citizens, murdering and killing children and women and men across the whole of the country. So let's be under no illusions what they have done. And then the geopolitical impact. And that's not to mention before it started to essentially force huge economic suffering in the west of Europe by cutting off the gas supplies that Western nations had become, albeit naively and very foolishly, completely and utterly dependent on. So I think Russia needs calling out, frankly, for what it is, for what it's done under its current leader, however long he may remain in place. There we go. That's my thought, but thanks, Romy, for that. I'm going to be talking about Sweden and their elections a bit later, and in a sense, and that's related to some of the very disturbing scenes we saw in Leicester last night, which, we need to be aware of. But firstly, I'm going to take, and if you give us a call, 0344 499 1000, if you've got something to say, what are your reflections on the lying in state, looking forward to the funeral or not tomorrow, and anything else. And from Dorset, Derek is on the line. Good morning, Derek.
Good morning, Richard. Can I say that my wife and I enjoyed you and your better half's slot last week?
Oh, thank you very much.
I can see who's boss there, incidentally.
I am. Of course I am, Derek.
I could see. I'm wartime generation, and I know that there was pressure on the royal family to fly to safety to Canada, which they refused, and they took the bombing like the rest of us did. My hometown was bombed 55 times. There's a couple of things I want to say. I've had contact with some members of the royal family. First of all, in 1953, I led the Dorset Regiment's coronation parade through Hong Kong with fixed bayonets. And
did you?
Basically, because I was tall, I was right-hand marker. So if I went out of step, everyone went out of step.
That's quite a responsibility then, Derek.
It is. And the other thing is King Charles agreed to my request to change some of the names at Poundbury. I carried out a campaign to remember the Dorset Regiment's battle honours, and he kindly agreed to my request and asked me for some more names if I wanted. I had to take on the local council, who said it would glorify war, but I used the power of the media to
well done.
To hoist the white flag, and I'm grateful for Prince Charles for that. I spent a day with Princess Anne when she came into prison I was working at to see the changes I'd made. And also, a good member of the royal family is the Duke of Kent. He came down to the area when I done a further plaque for the Dorset, and he's a good man, and he works quietly away.
Well, they do, and that's the point, isn't it, Derek, that actually so many of them work tirelessly, very often not realised by, and not recognised by parts of the media, but they really do put in so much work across the country.
Princess Anne has always been a friend of the prison service. quietly backing up prison staff, which no one else did. It's one of the most difficult jobs in the country. But getting back to the wartime generation, we will feel it considerably because she was a link to what we had to put up with. And basically now, my dental appointment has been changed for a 2-year wait, would you believe?
I can't believe it, Derek. I think you need to have a word with your dentist in the same way you had a word with a local council and sort them out.
But she will be missed. She was a good woman, and as I say, Princess Anne is a hard-working royal, the Duke of Kent.
And I'm sure they will continue. Derek, I've just got to take another call before we move to the top of the hour. But, Derek, thank you so much for ringing and sharing those thoughts with us. And I think you're right, actually, that the elder generation will have, in a sense, the closest link to Her Majesty the Queen, and therefore will, in a sense, possibly be amongst the saddest of that. But let's take a call now back to London, where Carol is on the line. Hi, Carol.
Good morning, Richard.
How are you? How are you feeling? What are your thoughts? What's on your mind?
Well, I did get a bit weepy when our poor Queen passed by, and it was very unexpected. I wasn't expecting that at all. I have had somebody who passed a long time ago, my sister, when I was a teenager, of leukemia. It did bring up a bit of that, even though I'm 57 years old now. But it's very sad that she was gone.
It was so unexpected, just literally 2 days after she had appointed a new Prime Minister.
That was what the surprise was. Sorry to interrupt. Yeah, that's what it really was. It was like we call the calm before the storm, the tsunami that's very calm, beautiful, and then boom, within hours, a drastic change. It's looking out for things like that, isn't it? We just don't know when it's going to happen.
Completely, but in a sense, to do her duty like that, it's almost as though she waited to see in her 15th Prime Minister.
Yes, almost. And I also wanted to pop over to give you a compliment personally. When I turned on the TV this morning, and you were there doing your Sunday sermon, speaking about celebrating a life well lived. It's wonderful for her and for us. Your advice, looking forward with enthusiasm, worked for me. The worst ethics you talked about, the Queen, it helped me. It was like you were giving a life coaching session, and I needed it so badly. At 57, I'm starting a degree, because I always regretted my whole life.
That's fantastic. Well, I mean, it's never too late to learn. It's sort of lifelong learning. Well done, you.
Right. And you're wonderful. When you came on, you talked about commitment, that the Queen was wonderful at doing, and I'm sure King Charles will do the same. You talked about preparation. She was wonderful at doing that. And I thought, God, I was doing that all up until 3 o'clock this morning, preparing for my studies, because it will be hard with children. And I just wanted to say thank you so much.
No, thank you for those thoughts. I mean, and are you... obviously tomorrow is going to be a big day. Will you be glued to the screen? Will you be watching it with family and friends?
I'll be watching it at home with my children. Quietly, I imagine. My parents will be watching. They're in their 80s, and we'll be talking on the phone. And I'll be seeing my parents next week. We'll be talking about it again. But on the TV. Today I might go to church and do a celebration. Well done.
Well done. Well, that's brilliant. Carol, thank you so much for calling. I really do appreciate that. That's Carol from London, who at 57 is starting a new degree. There you are, you see. A life of learning and moving forward. And actually, I think that, as I touched on in my sermon about the Queen, she always listened, and I think was always learning about, how things are moving forward in the nation. Meanwhile, Angela has just messaged in, and this is, it's the other side of the debate. Charles, man of the people, ? Owns half of Cornwall, travels with his own toilet seat. I wasn't aware of that. and uses a fountain pen and then loses it when it leaks. Well, listen, actually, I don't think he does own half of Cornwall now. I think that's passed over to the new Prince of Wales, Prince William. So he's just lost that. But anyway, Angela is clearly not a fan of the new King Charles. Nevertheless, I think that he has started well. He's got an awesome responsibility, and I think there's a lot of people who essentially want this to succeed and move forward and have stability when so much else is so, in a sense, uncertain and unstable. But let's go to London, stay in London, where Nigel is on the line. Hi, Nigel.
Good morning, Richard. Well, it's nice to speak to you. I wanted to give you a quick story about the outpouring of grief, sympathy and respect in the United States, where I just returned from, because I lived there part of the year.
Oh, great. Thank you.
And the amount of American people, friends, neighbours and people I've met when I'm out and about, while I was there, have come over and offered their sorrow at the passing of the Queen is quite remarkable, really. I'm not saying that I actually expected. As a news photographer, there was a billboard outside a casino in Las Vegas, had a massive portrait of the Queen illuminated, sort of as a respect to Her Majesty passing. So I think that was great. So it's quite remarkable how she touched every corner of the world and millions of people.
Absolutely right. And I think that's going on all over the world, particularly in the Commonwealth countries. They say that the funeral tomorrow is going to be watched literally by billions of people, either live or on catch-up, depending on the different time zones. The biggest funeral and commemoration ever.
It is, and also, if you look back at the last few days, and I've only been back a few days, but if you look back at sort of the last 9 days, I think it is now, the amount of organisation, the pomp and circumstance, and the way it's gone flawlessly well, apart from some idiot trying to, have a go at the coffin, and some idiot the other day, if you saw on a skateboard, tried to go towards a royal cortege. But I think it's been brilliant. It's just phenomenal how this has gone and how the eyes of the world are looking at it.
You're so right, Nigel. I slightly mischievously tweeted out, I got a bit of flack for it, but I tweeted out at the back end of last week that the British military and the logistics, we're so brilliant at the pomp, the pageantry, the ceremony, foot perfect, split-second timing, the logistics, and I sort of said, maybe sort of ex-military people should actually, maybe they should run the NHS, the police, energy, water, courts, you name it, passports. I mean, they do seem to do things rather well, don't they?
No, I think that would be a pretty good idea, because at the moment they're all those other services are in rather disarray. But it is quite remarkable, isn't it, that it's all come together. I mean, like a sort of Swiss watch, it just ticks perfectly, and it's quite remarkable that there hasn't been any hiccups whatsoever. And the spotlight is on this country, which is Great Britain, and I think this has put a bit more of great back into Great Britain.
I think that's right. I really do think that is right. I think it's sort of, people are very sad and shocked, but in a sense, you see that accession ceremony, you thought actually, it sort of proved the depth of our history. And I think that actually gave people a sense of reassurance and sort of slightly intuitively confidence.
Yeah. Did you? I don't know if you saw the speech made by Boris Johnson in Parliament last week. I thought it was quite fantastic, to be honest with you.
Yeah, it was Boris at his best, actually. I mean, he sort of semi-combed his hair, not fully, but nevertheless, it was Boris at his best.
Yeah, I thought so. 8 minutes plus of him. And just one closing point. I wish, obviously, King Charles every success in galvanising the country and in his leadership as a king. I just hope that he can remain apolitical and not go left or right and step out the box like the Queen never did, of course.
You're absolutely right. And he said that in his first speech, that he would. He's a human being. He'll find it. There'll be moments when he finds that a bit challenging, but I hope that he sticks to, being completely neutral, and others take on the interest that he had, and that's perfectly legitimate in a democracy. Nigel, great call. Thank you very much indeed for that. That was Nigel, also in London. After the break, we'll be talking to Rupert Bell. Lots of messages and tweets coming in. We've got pictures there on the screen of the queue That is the South Bank, just the other side from the Houses of Parliament. If you got to that point in the queue, you're nearly there, folks. You've probably got an hour or so in Victoria Gardens. If any of you are in the queue listening, do give us a call. Let us know what it's like. 0344 499 1000. Dan from Kent messages in. This is great. It makes me smile seeing Charles in the Inkwell situation, because that's the Duke of Edinburgh in him. I think that's so true. The Queen was so gracious and the Duke so human. I hope King Charles has a long and successful reign. Absolutely right. But, you know, it was that little bit of sort of the Duke in him, wasn't it? Without question at all. And frankly, as I said, if the fountain pen is the only issue that goes wrong, then that really is proof about the quality of the arrangements. Amy says here, I also believe in good manners and politeness, but to be treated with respect, you have to treat others with respect. And Amy says, Charles has proved himself to be a hypocrite with his net zero agenda. Well, I think that will be a real test for him, whether he can, in a sense, leave that now to others, because that is a big political debating of it. Stay with us. Coming up after the news, it's Rupert Bell. It's Talk TV.
Straight talking, no nonsense, and annoying all the right people. This is Talk TV.
As we bid farewell to our cherished monarch, join Talk TV to reflect on an extraordinary life of service and dedication.
Welcome back, my friends. We're into the second hour of Tice Talk this Sunday morning, before tomorrow's big funeral. Lots of messages and tweets coming in. Lots of you quite grumpy about King Charles and his influence on the Green agenda, and I think this is the key test for him. We've got one message here which says, Richard, don't forget the enormous harm Charles is doing to the people of this country, those on low incomes, with his green claptrap. Well, look, before he's become king, he's expressed a view, but it is a political issue, and I think those of you who listen to me know very much which side I'm on this. But the test for him now is that he's got to be neutral. I hope he is. I think he will be. But there's no question that the net zero, the cost of net zero, impacts the least well off the most, and this is a key battleground, and many of us will fight it. But we're going to stay on the arrangements for tomorrow and matters around that, because I'm delighted to be joined in the studio by a man who I think's almost been sleeping in the studio, actually, Rupert Bell. Good morning to you, Rupert.
Good morning, Richard, yes.
Listen, I was in the queue very early, back on Wednesday, but the queue's sort of growing and growing. We're speaking a bit later this half hour to Lance Foreman, who was in the queue yesterday and met the King in the queue, who came and had a chat, which was amazing. But I think you've got a bit of news about the length of the queue and what may be going on.
Well, clearly this is the day they've got to manage it, because there's a cut-off point. So you have to work back from 6:30 tomorrow morning. They're saying at the moment that it's about a 13-14 hour queue. Well, that means that anyone from, say, 4:30, they're going to have to shut. But what they are now definitely saying, the DCMS, who are responsible for this queue, do not turn up, do not set out, i.e. come from afar. As I mentioned earlier, I was hearing about someone who'd set up from Somerset, got to London at 4 o'clock, and then to go and join the queue. So they're going to be fine, but obviously a long wait to get there. But it's actually how they're going to manage the end of the queue, i.e. when they shut the gate and say no more wristbands are being handed out.
I think that is a key point, a key sensitivity, actually, that it's probably the smart thing to do, maybe, not to join the queue now, but to focus on other places that one can see the Queen's coffin go past. Either, pretty difficult between Westminster Hall and Westminster Abbey, but there may be some opportunity after the funeral, between Westminster Abbey and up to Wellington Arch or beyond.
Well, yes, and obviously the 25-mile route between Wellington Arch and Windsor. There will also be the answer is there will be places to get a vantage point from Westminster Abbey up to Wellington Arch. But clearly they're talking about 1 million people coming into London, that sort of wanting just to be in town, as it were. And that's the thing to manage. And it obviously is giving the security forces and everyone a headache as to how they manage the crowds and people's level of expectation, because that's the important thing. People will be getting their vantage point from a very early time in the morning. So, as you say, maybe you have to switch your emphasis from thinking I'll join the queue, but then what do? Do you then go and put down your chair?
Sometimes it's best to think what others are not doing.
Well, you've got to think out. I think there's an element of thinking outside the box. You actually played a smart move. You went in early on Wednesday, and I think you were about 5 hours.
Yes, that's right.
Which is, let's be honest, that's manageable.
That's a breeze compared to many.
You were lucky, right? But some people, I was actually saying that by the time they got to Westminster Bridge, they've queued 5 hours.
Yeah.
So that gives you an indication. And then they were thinking from Westminster Bridge, it was probably another 5 hours. Isn't it 2 hours when you're snaking around having crossed Lambeth Bridge? So, every stage you think you're getting, when you're walking along and you've got the Houses of Parliament at the other side of the river, it's within touching distance. But it's not.
It's not. It's a bit like joining a sort of a Disney queue, if you've been on one of those. Yeah. They always you think you're nearly there, and then you turn a corner and you see another sort of snake-like queue, and then there's another corner, and then there's another one. But so that 25-mile journey from Wellington Arch where the Queen's coffin is transferred from the gun carriage into the hearse. So the route of that will obviously be in all the newspapers.
It is.
And if people do want to pay the last respect, that is the smart thing to do, is to go somewhere on that route. There'll be lots of people there, but that sort of reminds me a bit like the journey of Princess Diana from London up to Althorpe.
It's going to be exactly that, and it's taking 2 hours, so it's a 25-mile journey. So clearly, doing the maths, it's 12. They're going to be travelling at 12 miles an hour, more or less, 12.5 miles an hour. To get my maths absolutely right. So that means it's not hurtling past, therefore deliberately so that people can pay their respects along the route. And this is why they were just sort of they didn't produce it straight away. They just needed to make sure that they could maximise the potential for as many people as possible, because that's probably going to be...
And that seems to be the smart thing to do for people who do want to see the coffin now, is to join that route, which will be in the papers, and that's 25 miles, and that'll be either side, and it'll be closed off. But I suspect there'll be many places there where you'll get to the front.
Hopefully that will be the case, but yet it is everywhere now. You can easily find it online, papers, you name it, because they publicised it. So, but that's going to be that's going to be part of the spectacle of tomorrow. There's no two ways about it. The procession, the numbers of people who want to feel part of it, aside from the 2,000 people who are in the Westminster Abbey, and I think around about 800, attend the St George's service. I may have got that number a bit wrong, but I think it's around about
and
that.
And the St George's service, that's about mid-afternoon, isn't it?
I think it's 4 o'clock till 5, because what happens is you then get to between 1 and 3 is the travelling. The coffin is taken out of the hearse, and once again there is a procession into St George's Chapel.
Yes.
And then obviously that service will begin. So that's how it works tomorrow. But it's very staged managed, as you would expect. Every detail has been thought of. We'll hear the actual details of the service in Westminster Abbey later on today, which is the Queen's bidding, and actually according to the Archbishop of York, it will be an uplifting service, something that, So
she had a big input in that. In the same way the Duke of Edinburgh had complete input into his service, didn't he?
Yeah, because actually all these arrangements, because of the nature of this, have been planned. The Queen would have been signing off on her own funeral. Now, that sounds obviously a bit morbid, but the reality is that you are dealing with a state situation, so it is slightly more... she has to almost take her own mortality out of the equation, saying, well, what's going to work? Which is quite hard.
Very hard. And so let's just look just beyond the funeral, because, there's, in a sense, under the new king, and so lots of arrangements will change. And you sort of think some of the Queen's, dearest hobby, for example, and your speciality, racing and horses... What's going to happen there? You've got, she had obviously lots of horses in training. To what extent is Camilla going to pick that up? She's obviously very interested in matters equestrian. It's quite a thing for a lot of people.
Well, I think actually there's a lot of things that are sort of slightly up in the air. You can even basically say, what about the patronages that the Queen had? And she had countless. And so where are they going to be moved on to over the next few months? Because those are the issues that now have to start being resolved. In terms of the practicalities of our horse world, we know the horses... on all aspects, not just the racing. In fact, in Scotland, she was passionate about breeding horses that were bred specially to walk across the Scottish Highlands, and then in other horse breeds. So the racing obviously was the high profile, but she loved showing horses, and she was just as happy to win a £20 shopping voucher at the Royal Windsor Horse Show in one of the classes there, as winning the Ascot Gold Cup.
I think that gets me... I know from experience, horses in every which way, they're not cheap.
No, this is an expensive operation. She has a stud. Obviously, she has plenty of horses in training, with a wide range of trainers, including my brother is absolutely delighted to be was one of her trainers.
That's right.
And so that will obviously be something that John Warren and his team, who is the racing manager, will obviously now be looking to say, how do we take it forward? Because obviously her input was absolutely integral and passionate. Clearly, Camilla loves racing, loves horses, but clearly there will be a different dynamic from her, but nonetheless she will be keen to be seen to be involved and help be there as a bit of advice.
Sure. Rupert, thank you so much for that, for those thoughts about what's going on tomorrow, where the best vantage point to watch given the cues. That's Rupert Bell, the talk radio royal guru and indeed racing guru. Thanks for that. And we've just got time to go to Joan, who's in Guildford in Surrey. Good morning, Joan.
Good morning. Yes.
How are you? What's on your mind?
Well, it was just that I was so impressed with the guards and all those that took part. And you were saying this morning that perhaps it would be a good idea if looking towards the way that they can run the National Health Service and all the others. And I thought, what's lacking, I'm afraid, today in schools is discipline. I hate to say it, but I can see such a lack of discipline in life these days, and I think we ought to be considering this more. That's why the army and all these forces are so well trained and so absolutely on. There wasn't one mistake made.
It is remarkable, but it's that constant. It is discipline, and it's that constant sort of structure of an understanding of what every sort of cog in the wheel, every piece of the jigsaw has to do to make the whole thing work. And of course the rehearsals. I'm going to be talking about it later, but I mean they rehearse in the middle of the night, Joan.
I know. Well, of course, but it's a lifetime of training. Well, maybe they used to have the training. You went in. I think it might be a good idea if any youngsters who have left school, have finished school, and are hanging around and they haven't got a job, that they go into the Territorial Army for a year and a half, say, and maybe learn a trade, maybe not so much arms, but rather physical discipline, and also learn things like carpentry and...
I know, good point, Joan, or indeed go into the armed forces, full stop. No, I take the point, Joan. I think that, the armed forces, the TA, does give one a real sense of structure and belonging to a big team. Joan, great call from Guildford. Thank you very much for that. Coming up after the break, we're going to be talking to a man who was in the queue yesterday and met the King. Don't go anywhere. You're listening to Tice Talk here on Talk TV. Welcome back, my friends, to Tice Talk here this Sunday morning. Give us a call if you want to give us your thoughts. Are you in the queue? Are you how are you feeling about the last day of lying in state? How are you feeling about tomorrow's funeral? Or what your hopes and indeed possible fears are for the new Carolean era under King Charles? Well, talking of the queue, there he was yesterday morning, standing in the queue for a number of hours, and a good friend of mine, Lance Foreman, was getting near Lambeth Bridge, and suddenly something rather extraordinary happened. Well, I'm delighted that Lance is with me now on Zoom to talk about it. Lance, a very good morning to you. You must be... tell us, what happened after you'd been queuing for how long?
Well, it was quite an extraordinary experience. And I have to say, actually, Richard, you sort of partially inspired me. I was listening to you chatting with Vanessa a few days ago on Talk TV, and I think you were in the queue, and I was listening to you, and I thought, you know what, I really ought to do that myself. And so I decided to go on the pilgrimage yesterday. I got up very early in the morning and arrived... I started queuing at 1:30 in the morning.
Wow.
And, the aim was, to go on that march and eventually see the Queen lying in state. But 11 hours on, there we were, wandering over the final bridge. Lambeth Bridge is the last bridge before approaching Westminster Hall. And there was a long line of us sort of queuing up, and you have to leave the other side of the pavement obviously free, because there might be people coming the other way.
Yes.
But we noticed that there were a lot of marshals, many more than there were, anywhere else, and also a lot of TV crew. And we thought, this is a bit, interesting. And then we started hearing helicopters up above. And then the marshal said, quickly, come to the barriers, you're going to be very happy. So we thought, this is rather interesting. What's going on here? And the next thing we knew, there was King Charles wandering down, greeting people, chatting to people, accepting people's condolences.
And there he is on the screen, meeting you.
There he was meeting me. When I joined the queue, I did something I haven't done for a long, long time. I wore my old college scarf. I don't think I've worn it for 40 years. It's a Trinity College scarf. Actually, the same college that not only King Charles went to, but also your lovely presenter, Vanessa. We all went to Trinity College, Cambridge, and I was wearing the scarf. I don't know whether that's what caught his eye. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. And of course, immediately after he'd passed by, we started, people started sort of turning their heads to move along the queue again. And all the marshals said, no, don't go. We've got something even more special. And then 2 minutes later, Prince William followed on by. It was just the most extraordinary thing.
Absolutely extraordinary. And tell us about the sense of excitement, in the crowd after all that waiting. I mean, that is a serious sort of special, extraordinary present for you all.
It was. I mean, I was walking along with a couple of very nice ladies who are in the Navy. And so we'd had a good 11 hours of chatting on our way there. And one of them had met Prince Charles before, or King Charles before, and she couldn't hold back the tears. Just the excitement was, it was an experience that's, just one of those once-in-a-lifetime experiences. Of course, within seconds of this happening, I was starting to get loads and loads of text messages from my friends sort of saying, the Salmon King meets the real king. Which was rather amusing.
Absolutely. Well, that must have buoyed you up for the last bit over Lambeth Bridge and into the hall. Did you actually get any words with the king, or was he moving so quick?
No, just really just offering my condolences. I mean, there wasn't obviously time for long conversations. I have met him once before. He's the patron of the Royal Academy of Culinary Arts, which is something that our business was involved in founding many years ago. So I have met him once before, but of course he wasn't going to recognise me.
No,
and,
of course.
And it was just, I think that he wanted to show his appreciation for people, spending hours and hours queuing. And when I went along, I thought I was potentially up for a 24-hour queue.
And that's, just remarkable. And then Prince William afterwards. I think that's sort of possibly a slight difference here, is that the King and Prince William are going to want to be ever more visible, ever more present. That's the sort of what I'm taking from the last few days.
Well, I think so. I think they've obviously watched their mother and grandmother and, seen her engagement with the public and realised that, you have to be amongst the public and, for the monarchy to continue. We sort of feel to some extent that they are our family. We haven't lived life certainly without the Queen, and they're almost an extension of our family. And
they absolutely are, Lance. I mean, not only was the Queen the mother of her own family, but it felt to me a sort of mother of the nation. It seemed to me.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And when we did finally approach Westminster Hall, the atmosphere changed. There was a lot of jollity beforehand, and people were excited, tired, yes, but excited too. And obviously, the potential excitement was what kept us all going.
Absolutely.
But as you approach Westminster Hall, the sound sort of starts tempering down, and then you enter, and there's just complete silence. And the immediate view when you walk in is just quite, it's quite extraordinary. It almost felt, I mentioned before, it almost felt like it was so still, and the guards around were so still. Almost like you felt like you were almost walking into Madame Tussauds.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well done, you, Lance. Absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much. And how lucky you were. That was Lance Foreman, a friend of mine, who was in the queue, standing patiently after many, many hours, and suddenly there he was, the King, right in front of him. And then the Prince of Wales. Absolutely remarkable. That was Lance Foreman. Thank you very much. Lots of messages and tweets coming in. One here from Amber, who says, what will happen to the Queen's corgis? Well, as I understand, Prince Andrew has found himself a new job because he's going to be looking after the corgis. So I hope that answers that. Whilst Taff, I'm very grateful for this. Taff has just messaged in, says, Richard, any chance of a shout-out for St John's Ambulance? All the volunteers and on duty throughout, looking after the crowd. Of course, Taff. I'm sorry I didn't do that earlier, because actually they play a massive role, and I know that, unfortunately, but inevitably, they will have been called on duty to help various people in the queue, because, it takes its toll, that queue. But anyway, thanks for that, Taff, and for everybody else in all the volunteers, be it St John's Ambulance, but so many helping out with the logistics, with the queuing. It's a remarkable feat, the whole thing. Lots of other messages here, and one also about from Tony, who says, talking about Serco, actually, and the rising energy bills. Serco are paying the energy bills, and essentially now looking to rent homes. I'm going to be talking a bit later about Serco. And even looking to take over care homes, because of course you've got the huge number of people crossing the channel looking for student accommodation. This is a big growing issue that I will come back to, that is for sure. Well, moving on, other matters, of course, I did say earlier that I'd be talking about climate. I always like to have a section in the show about what I call climate sanity, or sometimes it's a climate brawl if it's someone who wants to debate a certain side of the argument. And I'm delighted now to be joined in the studio by Chris Morrison, who is the environment editor at the Daily Sceptic, very experienced journalist over many decades. Chris, a very good morning to you. Thanks for coming in to be with me in the studio in Tice Talk. And we're going to be talking about matters climate over the next 20 minutes or so. So please do give us a call, 0344 499 1000. If you've got any calls, any questions for me, or indeed for Chris about matters climate, because it is a massive issue. Various people have been tweeting about the cost of net zero, the impact of the World Economic Forum, concerns about now King Charles from what he said when he was Prince Charles. But Chris, you've been looking at the whole sort of climate debate for a very long time, and wrote a couple of interesting articles this week which really struck me, actually, because we hear lots of almost like a sort of a daily or every other day sort of fest of gloomy news. It's a miracle, actually, we wake up the following day. But actually, it's not just a one-way ticket. You've got some good news, and I think it's important to share good news out there.
Yes, I mean, I think the articles you're referring to are about the claims in the Attenborough's latest Frozen Planet 2 programme, in which he says that the summer sea ice in the Arctic could be all gone by 2035, 12 years' time. It's a slightly out-of-date prediction in that since the low point in 2012, the Arctic ice has actually, whisper it quietly, has actually been growing back slightly. Not a lot, but it has. It seems to be plateauing.
Let's just pause there, because that is quite significant. So, David Attenborough has got a new documentary. It's on tonight, isn't it?
Yes, I think he repeats the claim as well. From looking at what the previews.
But here's the thing. Let's just restate that the Arctic sea ice has been stationary, growing a little bit.
It's really growing back slightly. In fact, the results, the latest results for the middle of last August, is that it's now quite considerably more than it was at an equivalent peak 10 years ago. The European Union's Copernicus Weather Service reports that overall sea ice, this is winter and summer, is now only 3% below the 1990-2020 average. The latest monthly data is apparently something, I think, like the 12th lowest in the satellite record. So it is growing back ever so slightly, yes.
This, I think, is absolutely remarkable, because one thing's for sure, that if it was declining, then the BBC would be shouting it from the rooftops every single hour of every single day.
Yes.
David Attenborough, you've written that actually in this documentary he's making some very specific claims about a specific area of the Arctic region that Attenborough refers to in terms of melting sea ice in the summer and the impact on polar bears. Let's get to the bottom of that.
Yeah. Well, he I think, as far as I can see, he went to an area north of Norway, quite high up in the Arctic, called Svalbard. And Svalbard is an interesting archipelago in that it is probably not the best place to go to make these sorts of claims about overall populations across the whole of the Arctic. It has a sort of microclimate. It's warmed. It's also known as Spitsbergen, which is the largest island, and it's warmed by the West Spitsbergen current, which actually gives it a microclimate that's slightly warmer, and it does actually break up the sea ice a little bit quicker. There's also some recent work by a couple of scientists who point out that the West Spitsbergen current has actually warmed itself very slightly and got slightly saltier over the last 2-3 decades. So really, the actual the polar bears feed mainly in the spring. The Arctic is still a very, very cold place. So what happens is that the Arctic, the ice is still there, May, June, up until July. And that's when the polar bears do their biggest feeding. And they're not affected by the fact that there has been more melting of the summer ice. There's another interesting thing about the summer ice as well, which there has been melting in the Arctic. It is warming slightly, and there are reasons which we'll go into later as to why that is so. Taking away the summer ice, which is a temporary thing,
yes,
it also brings in more sunlight. And it helps the food chain within the Arctic. So you get more algae, you get more fish, you get more seals, and ultimately you get more polar bears. Because another thing that perhaps Mr. Attenborough, Sir David, has failed to point out is that polar bear numbers have risen from the 1970s from 5,000 to estimates now of about 32,000.
This is remarkable, and it does seem to me that Sir David Attenborough, who's widely respected and admired around the world and produces some amazing documentaries, we've all seen them, but he's being a bit selective with the real information from what you're saying. I mean, if he's talking about summer melting ice, but if the polar bears are feeding in April, May, then he should have set that out in the full context?
Well, they mainly feed in April, May, but they still feed whenever they can, of course. And there's still a lot of ice around, even in the summer. I mean, I think the highest temperature in Svalbard is something like 7 degrees centigrade. I mean, you wouldn't go there for a summer holiday unless you want to go watch the glaciers in puffer jackets. Yes, but the whole, on a wider point, the whole, sort of thing about this climate change is that every event is now catastrophised. I mean, David Attenborough's probably not talking a great deal about the coral reefs, for instance, which he was forecasting their sort of, imminent demise at some point over the last 5 years. The last 2 years have seen record growth at the coral reefs, and there's now more coral there than there has been for 35 years. Nobody's covering that.
That's right, and Philip, I did touch on that recently, but it does seem to me that there's lots of good news out there that the mainstream media are not covering because it doesn't suit the narrative. The Great Barrier Reef, all the experts said it was permanently damaged, it was finished, it was on its way out.
Yeah, of course they did, yes.
And actually it turns out not to be the case, and we're sort of told to believe in the consensus of experts, but very often it turns out the consensus isn't always right, is it?
Well, I would say there's something very worrying about what happened with the coral reefs, because they must have known what actually occurred. Corals grow from about 23 centigrade to about 32. Now, the Great Barrier Reef is below that. It's actually sort of in the lower range. And what coral doesn't like is it doesn't like sudden spikes, and it bleaches. And what we have had in the last decade, when all this catastrophe stuff came about, is we've had two very, very powerful El Nino oscillations, which are natural weather oscillations. And what they've done is they have increased the temperature quite dramatically, 2 or 3 degrees, and so the coral spikes. There's also a bit of cyclone damage and jellyfish damage and whatever, and they had a bad time in the 2010s. But of course, as soon as all that went, they've all grown back like topsy. It's all come back. I mean, because it's a natural thing. This has been going on for hundreds of millions of years.
So why don't all these experts, why don't they think that it might come back? Why are they so negative that it's just a one-way ticket?
Well, why do they catastrophise every weather event? Why, when there's a monsoon in Pakistan, do they claim that a third of the country is covered in water, when if anybody who looks at the map can see that, a great deal of Pakistan is mountainous, and the actual figure is about 8%? Why do they, constantly, every bushfire, every hot day, why do they catastrophise every single event? And, of course, the reason is because this is not a scientific narrative, in my view. It's a political narrative. It's a political narrative to get us to believe in this command and control net zero agenda, which is I think, I don't think, it's a hard left agenda to change the way we heat, holidays we have, the whole thing, the whole net zero. And so there's really a political campaign going on, whereas and not they're when you hear the word settled science, the T should be on edge, because there's no such thing as settled science in science, but there is in politics.
Well, that's right. And, I mean, again, we want, the overall information and, the good, the bad, and if it's ugly, then we need to hear the ugly. But at the moment, from the mainstream media, we only seem to get sort of the invented bad in many cases. And there's other news, for example, that you referred to in the temperature in Antarctica last winter.
Yes. The coldest winter ever since records began in 1957. You didn't hear it on the mainstream media. They ignored it. It was simply ignored. And yet, and we're talking about a 6-month period. If you look at the satellite record, and we could talk about the satellite record, the accurate record, compared with the surface data sets that seem to be constantly adjusted.
Yes.
If you look at the satellite record, you'll see there's been very little warming over Antarctica since about 1979, when the satellites first went up there. And it's because there has been warming, and nobody denies there's been, we had a warming period. The temperature has risen by about 1 centigrade in the last 150 years. Nothing unusual in that. It's happened countless times in the paleoclimatic and historical past. But if you look at the way global warming has affected the planet, it's affected the northern hemisphere more, where there's more land. It's affected the tropics slightly less, and it's affected the southern hemisphere, in particular Antarctica. Again, it's less. And so we get down to the bottom of the South Pole, and there has been, as far as we can see, negligible warming for the last 50 years.
And because there's a weather station on the South Pole, isn't there?
Yeah.
So records began in the 1950s.
Yeah. And also, so you can trust that, because there is actually a weather station, as you say, the Amundsen, I think it's the weather station. Whereas at the North Pole, which is water, there are a lot less permanent stations.
I just want to repeat that before we go to the break. The coldest winter in the South Pole, in the Antarctica, since record began.
Well, since 1957.
Since 1957, which is when records began. Just reflect on that, folks, whilst we take a quick break, because that's extraordinary. And you'll hear common sense, you'll hear good news on Talk TV, but I'm not hearing it anywhere else. Stay with us, don't go anywhere. It's Tice Talk, it's Talk TV. Welcome back, my friends, to Tice Talk here on Talk TV. Keep those calls coming in, 0344 499 1000, or the tweets. And we are having what I call my climate sanity section. I've got in the studio Chris Morrison, who is the environment editor at the Daily Skeptic. And folks, whatever you're doing next Sunday, do not miss it, because it's important to look at both sides of the debate. And I've got a gentleman from the Grantham Institute and the London School of Economics called Bob Ward. He's coming into the studio next weekend, putting the other side of this debate so that we can chew about it, ask questions. It's important that we have a rational debate and we get to the answers, and that where there's good news, we share it, and that's what we're trying to do at the moment. So we've got on the line Jackie from Manchester, who's called in with a question for Chris. Jackie, good morning. Thank you for dialing in. You've got a question for Chris, have you?
Yes, good morning to you both. I've read various research papers and studies on climate change, but I did come across one that looked at the correlation between CO2 and global warming. And what it suggested was that temperature actually rises before CO2 levels do, which would mean that CO2 isn't pushing the increased warming. So is there any credibility in this hypothesis?
Great question, Jackie.
Yeah, hello, Jackie. Thanks for calling in. Yes, you're absolutely right. There's a great deal of evidence that suggests that temperature rises before carbon dioxide. There's a very famous ice core in Antarctica called the Vostok core, where they drilled down and got data from about 500,000 years ago. And they found that very often the temperature rose before carbon dioxide levels rose. And there's also a huge amount of evidence in the paleoclimatic record when you go to, further back. And the reason for that is probably quite simple, in that temperature rises naturally. There are these huge variations in temperature. The ones we've seen recently are nothing out of the ordinary. In fact, there have been much higher ones in the past, over shorter periods, in fact. The reason is that when the temperature rises naturally through a whole load of natural factors, then the oceans will warm slightly, and a huge store of CO2 is within the oceans. And of course, therefore, you know what happens when you warm a liquid? It releases gas. So all the CO2 that was sequestered from days when the carbon dioxide levels were much, much higher on the Earth, there's a certain amount of releasing. And the other thing interesting about that is that it's a more plausible explanation for the connection between temperature and CO2, sorry, I'm having trouble with the earpiece. And that is that temperature rises. Temperature rises before the CO2. It's a more plausible explanation to say why. If we look, there are very few links that sort of, suggest that, CO2 and the temperature, it explains a lot of why the climate changes. Because if you look in the paleoclimatic, the historical record, people struggle to make a link. They struggle. CO2 rises and temperature rises. So, as I say, it is a more plausible explanation. And, of course, it's not something you would necessarily see other than your excellent reading of scientific papers.
Is that helpful, Jackie? Does that answer your question?
It's brilliant. Thank you ever so much.
Jackie, thank you very much for calling. Great question. Keep those calls and questions coming in. We're going to go from Manchester over to Ilkley, where Craig is on the line. Morning, Craig. How are you doing?
I'm very well, Richard. Good morning to you and good morning.
Morning. Morning. Have you got a question for Chris?
I do have a question, and I read an article on Market Watch last year, which is a reputable, financial website, so not some kind of tinfoil hat, conspiracy website. And it describes how the seas and seabeds around the UK are actually the property of Crown Estates, and it details how each year the licensing of that seabed to wind farms is netting the royal family, millions, hundreds of millions of pounds. It's estimated to be around £1 billion a year, of which all goes to the Treasury, but the Crown Estates or the Crown gets a kickback of sorts through sovereign grants. So it could explain, and we often hear the phrase in movies and TV programmes, follow the money, why the former Prince of Wales has been so controversial when it comes to the environment and the green agenda, because their ability to license that seabed and offshore estate is helping them to net millions and billions. And the article that I did read said they shortlisted a list of preferred bidders, and I can guarantee the list of preferred bidders wouldn't have been the bidders of the lowest figure. It would have been the bidders who were prepared to pay the most. So that could explain, some of our electricity bills. So I'd like to ask if Chris is aware of the Crown Estate licensing of the seabed.
Chris.
Wind farms.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. Whenever I hear, comments like yours, I'm reminded of Professor Richard Lindzen, who's a distinguished atmospheric scientist, meteorologist from MIT, who says that the whole narrative, the whole climate emergency, the rush to renewables, he says it's absurd. He said it's just absurd. But trillions of dollars to grant-dependent academics, to all of this stuff that's going on, the renewable business, says it's not absurd. And that's the point, that we're being sort of persuaded to go down this net zero route because there are trillions of dollars involved. There's huge profits to be made from renewable industry. Renewable industry is, as far as I can see, more or less useless to actually power a modern industrial society. And the only way that you can put all these wind farms up and solar panels is offer enormous subsidies. And of course they say, oh well, now that gas has gone up, then it makes sense to go for wind. Well, the reason gas has gone up is there's a shortage, but the actual cost of producing gas hasn't gone up. And once we start actually producing more of the stuff, the price will come down.
So to clarify, Craig, my understanding is that, just pick up your point about the Crown Estate, the Crown Estate actually essentially now, as part of the deal that was done with the Sovereign, all its profits go to the Treasury, and then the royal family receive, I think, around about 15% of the profits. They're certainly not receiving billions of pounds, but it would be tens. I think the royalties from the wind farm licenses, I think, would be in the tens of millions. But we can certainly check that, and I'll ask Aaron to check that information so that we get back to you, because that is the situation. Does that help you there, Craig?
It does, yes, and I think it's a question that does need to be answered, because, they should be, if it really is for the benefit of the country, they should be licensing those wind farms at nil cost, shouldn't they, to help lower the cost for people?
Well, essentially, the balance, so if it's about 85%, that does come to the country. My issue, Craig, is that the majority of the ownership of all the wind farms is actually owned by multinational overseas investors, including the Danish government, which is the biggest single investor through a company called Ørsted. And so they're making huge windfall profits. There's a certain irony, isn't there? There's windfall profits out of the wind, and it's us, the British taxpayer, that's paying all the subsidies, which are inflation-linked.
I'd make the point that, if someone owns the land, and you will get a sort of rent for owning the land, and in the same way the aristocracy before owned a lot of the coal mines. I think the Queen Mum had quite a lot of coal mines in her portfolio. So people who own the land, and of course the royal family and a lot of people own a lot of land, are going to do very well out of putting these concrete monstrosities on the land and charging a rent.
Great call. Thank you very much indeed. We're going to head from Ilkley in Yorkshire, I'm assuming that's that Ilkley, down to Basingstoke, where Simon has, I think, a question for Chris. Good morning, Simon.
Yes, good morning, and good morning, Chris. It's nice to hear someone say that science is never settled. As someone who studied physics at University College London, I think that's one of the things that I didn't understand before I went to university. My question is, when did the climate issue become an emergency? Because it seems to me that this was very closely timed with the events after the great crash we had in 2008, and when the Chinese advantage in low-cost labour was disappearing. And it's interesting that whilst we are being forced to head to net zero, China's burning 3 billion tonnes of coal a year and planning to build at least another 80 coal-fired power stations each year from now until 2060. So my question really is, who is benefiting from this in geopolitical terms? And perhaps we should take a closer look at the green movement to see where its funding comes from.
Yeah, I mean, these questions are always asked, when did it first start? I think it's been, I go back in a small way back to the decline of Christianity has meant that we're no longer as religious a culture, certainly in Europe and North America. And I think that some of it is to do with this worship of Gaia, the idea that we've been prosperous for too long, the idea of original sin, the idea that we're destroying the planet and whatever. So, you see a lot of these Extinction Rebellion people dancing and mystical sort of ways and all that sort of stuff. So I think there's an element of the religious. I think that there's also, it's been going on really for 20, 30, 40 years. They had a bit of a go with global cooling, if you remember, in the 70s, and that didn't really work out very well. And then they got lucky. There was a jump in temperatures, again, nothing that we haven't seen before, from 1980 to 1998. And they got lucky, and it jumped a bit, and so everything went on the bandwagon. There was a big ecology movement. I mean, we're all environmentalists. None of us want to, destroy the planet. So it's really built over the years. And of course, once these movements build, you will get money coming in. You will get people thinking, oh, there's money around, you can make money. And so the whole thing is built with subsidies to academics to produce the catastrophe narrative, subsidies to the renewal factories, the renewal farms. Everything has been built over the last 30 years on this catastrophe narrative.
So just whilst we've been talking, my wonderful producer Aaron has clarified. So the Crown Estate has had a significant boost to its net profits after another leasing round of wind farms, which is a future payout of about 78 million, according to this. I'm not sure whether that's actually for the Crown Estate or that's the Royals' percentage of that, but we'll keep checking that out. It is important information, and renewables now represent around about, sometimes 20-25% of the daily electricity. But of course, what happens when the wind doesn't blow? Then you need your insurance policy, you need the gas, and of course, like any insurance, that adds to the costs. And all of the subsidies on the wind farms, which are inflation linked, that has meant that actually the cost they're receiving, the profits they're making, are absolutely enormous. Yes, that extra amount of 78 million, that's for the Crown Estate. So the Crown Estate is earning, and essentially we, the taxpayer, benefit to the tune of, I think, about 85% of that. But, it's important that everybody is told that, is given the truth. Now, I think we've got another call here from Steve, who is on the line. Hi, Steve.
Hello there.
Hi, have you got a quick question for Chris?
I have, yes. Well, you've just had Simon on talking about this climate insanity. You've got the Drax power station in Yorkshire that was built near the Selby coalfield. Now it's burning wood pellets from America that you know how far away that is, and they're getting a huge subsidy to burn this to make fuel.
They are indeed, Steve, about 800 million a year. I mean, Chris, what's the justification for this Drax power station burning biomass pellets? I mean, the government and the experts seem to think it's a good idea.
Well, there's no justification. It's just crazy. I mean, it's just ludicrous. And I mean, there's always nothing more to say about it. It's just daft. I do remember, though, one of the very first... Well, I got interested in the subject. It was about 2005. I remember going to a lecture, and someone was very eco-friendly, and he was talking about how his office had been powered by everything, and he said, and we have these special wood pellets made in Germany, and we fire it from there. And I thought, actually, that doesn't sound quite right. I mean... So it goes back some way, the idea, of course, is that they take wood that is grown now and they burn it and they release the CO2, but it's a cycle. What they don't perhaps understand is that the coal was once a tree and animals, and 300 million years ago, the CO2 was sequestered from an atmosphere that was much, much richer in carbon dioxide. And probably a lot more vegetation around as a result. And so the idea that you can... I just don't understand it. It's crazy, the idea that you can...
Let's see what Marion in Northumberland is thinking. Marion, have you got a question? Good morning. Have you got a question for Chris? Just, we've got a minute and a quarter, Marion.
No, I don't have a question. I just have a point.
Go for it.
I just don't... I'm just sick to death of all this sleazy claptrap and rhyme of politics, etc. The fact of the matter is... God created this planet, and we see it burning up and drowning before our eyes. We don't want to spend trillions to go to some grey ashen planet. We want that money to be spent on preservation of the rainforests that are the lungs of the world, and have every plant of medicine that can cure cancers, etc. We are killing our planet. And I'm sick to death of hearing about the money we're spending on the environment. We're spending trillions to get to a grey ashen planet that we've already visited and left a load of rubbish on. We want to preserve this beautiful planet.
Marion, that is for sure. We all want to protect and preserve the planet. We all want cleaner air, but we need to do it in a smart and proportionate way. Chris, absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much for coming in. Really appreciate your thoughts, your views. And just to reiterate, I'll be having in Bob Ward from the London School of Economics in next week to have another discussion about climate sanity, climate brawl. He'll be putting forward his views on some of those questions, and I really want your calls for him to take that. Coming up, lots more in the third and final hour. Don't go anywhere. It's Tice Talk. It's Talk TV.
The biggest issue in Britain right now has to be cost of living. How much everything is costing all of us to get to work, to pay for food, to pay for electricity and energy, and that's not a problem that's going to go away anytime soon.
As we bid farewell to our cherished monarch, join Talk TV to reflect on an extraordinary life of service and dedication.
Welcome back, my friends. Well, there we are. That was an interesting discussion with Chris Morrison, the environment editor at the Daily Sceptic. This time next week, we'll have Bob Ward put the other side of the climate debate, which is really important. Now, you can't please everybody. Phil has just messaged in. Richard, I don't know much about you or your party, but after seeing you on Talk TV, I won't be voting for you either. Very naive and sycophantic. Well, there we are. Get all views, all thoughts, and I can't please everybody. But thanks for listening and watching, Phil, anyway. And for dialing in, you can always call up 0344 499 1000 and expound on those thoughts. We've got Carl here who said absolutely correct about the climate. It's political. So many scientists are wrapped up in the political correctness and the groupthink of net zero. The reports they write are all modelling studies justifying extreme outcomes, and if they don't state it's got implications for climate change, then the funding will go. I do think that this is a key point. Follow the money if you don't understand something, and what is clear is that it's very difficult to get funding if you may possibly come up with some other news about climate other than there's an emergency or there's a crisis. Anyway, before my next guest from Sweden, who we're just dialing up, we're going to head to Nottinghamshire, where Phyllis is on the line. Good afternoon, Phyllis.
Good afternoon.
How are you doing? What's on your mind?
Well, when they talk about having heat pumps, and they say they're not very good anyway to get the heat up, what damage will it do to the subsoil, and what is living in the subsoil?
Yes, so you talk about because there's two types of heat pumps that I'm aware of, Phyllis. There's the air source, which are above ground, but I think are you talking about the ground source heat pumps?
Yes.
That have a sort of spider's network of pipes that go into the ground. Well, obviously there's the installation cost. There's the installation process where you've obviously got to dig them in, but thereafter, I'm not aware of any other damage it would do to the ground.
Well, it was just if they're extracting heat from that particular part of the soil, would it have any effect on what is living or what is growing in that area?
It's a great question, Phyllis.
I was wondering if it dried out and made it like sand.
It's a great question, Phyllis, and I will be completely honest, I've never heard of any damage. I know that they use ground source heating equipment, heat pumps, a lot in countries like Sweden. So we will try and find out as to whether or not there are any implications for the soil. But as I say, the air source heat pumps, that is what the government is recommending for, I think it's almost an obligation for new homes, and that do require also an additional cylinder in your home. Those actually, they're actually quite noisy, Phyllis, and of course very expensive to install. And they don't heat the water to the same temperature. So they work in a very, very well-insulated new home with very little air circulation. But if you've got a much older home where there's much more air circulation, then you're going to need much bigger radiators, you're going to need different pipe work, and you're going to need a big cylinder, which you may or may not have.
And also the expense, and you're not getting the heat that people require, because on people that have them, they've said they've had to put on additional heating to heat the home. Oh. So really, it's getting out of people's what they can afford.
That's right. It absolutely is, isn't it? And I think that's the concern that so many people have got. People are going to extraordinary measures. So it sounds to me like you'll be putting on your heating like everybody else, Phyllis, a lot less this winter.
That is correct.
Yeah. Phyllis, great call. Thank you so much. We've got some research to do, Aaron, because we need to find out if there's any impact on the ground from ground source heat pumps. Fantastic question, and I'll be completely honest, I don't know the answer, but we will try and dig it out for you. Anyway, although Phil wasn't very keen on me and is not going to vote for me, the good news is that Angela, on the other side, says that please stand in Surrey Heath and I will vote for you. There we are, you know, it's that's the joy of democracy. There's different views, different thoughts. And we've got a message that's just come in here from Jean, who says, Richard, the government's far too generous to the renewable contracts, offering the renewable contracts to foreign investors for the wind farms and the solar panels. They're making so much profit out of it. Why don't British companies get the contracts awarded by the government? Jean, this is a great question, and it really winds me up, frankly, because, look, I actually don't have a problem with wind farms per se, as long as they're not subsidised. They need to stand on their own 2 feet against the other energy sources. We've got all of this energy treasure we've got shale gas under our feet on land, and then we've got the offshore North Sea oil and gas. Diversity of source is absolutely fine, but why is it that so much of the wind farms are being owned and operated by foreign investors? They're making the windfall profits out of our wind, literally. You couldn't make it up. Anyway, I mean, you'd laugh if it wasn't so, so expensive for all of us. Anyway, talking of laughing, just before we're waiting for my Swedish guest to come on the line, I have got a little film for you of some funny moments for Her Majesty the Queen. Just take a look at this.
Perhaps you would like a marmalade sandwich. I always keep one for emergencies.
So do I. I keep mine in here.
Oh.
For later. I don't think this is going to work. With 2 hands.
There is a knife there. What? There is a knife if you want.
I know there is. This is something that is more unusual.
I was going to say, a sundial neatly planted in the shade.
Isn't it good? Yes.
Yeah.
Had we thought of that? That it was planted in the shade? It wasn't in the shade originally, I'm sure. But,
London.
Sounds like President Trump. President Obama.
Message? Oh, from Michelle. How very amusing. So you would like to watch it together?
Yes.
Let's have a look.
Hey, Prince Harry, remember when you told us to bring it at the Invictus Games?
Careful what you wish for.
Oh, really? Please.
Boom.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister of Canada, for making me feel so old.
Ladies and gentlemen, please stand for Her Majesty the Queen and His Royal Highness the Duke of Edinburgh.
The party is about to start, Your Majesty.
Happy Jubilee, ma'am. And thank you for everything.
That's very kind.
I must say, I think that is a fantastic just clip of some humorous moments for Her Majesty the Queen. I enjoy it every single time I watch it. Paddington Bear, James Bond, absolutely priceless. I refer to the Queen's sense of humour in my Sunday sermon, and that just reinforces it. It really is absolutely fantastic. We've got lots coming up this hour because the world goes on around us, and we've seen some very disturbing scenes in Leicester overnight, and also there's been something quite extraordinary going on in Sweden, where the sort of a slightly left of centre party, the Social Democrats, have controlled Swedish politics for decades and decades. But Sweden had an election last Sunday, and something really extraordinary and unexpected and surprising has happened, which is that the sort of the populist right-wing party, the Sweden Democrats, has done surprisingly well and is going to be involved in what appears to be the new emerging coalition. So I'm delighted to be joined now by Swedish commentator and historian Lars Tregard on the line from Sweden to talk about this and the implications and the reason why the electorate have in a sense surprised the establishment. It's a sort of theme that I think has resonance here in the UK. Lars, a very good afternoon to you. Thanks for joining me on Tice Talk here on Talk TV. So this is potentially a very significant moment in Swedish politics, it seems to me. Please just give my listeners and viewers a sense as to the significance of what's happened and why, and what the Sweden Democrats, a sort of populist right-wing party, what they've been campaigning on.
Well, I mean, first of all, I think the viewers should understand that this has been sort of a long time coming. You're right to emphasize that it is a significant moment, to be sure. But it's also true that the Sweden Democrats have been growing, over every election over the past 8 elections. So it's the only party, in fact, that has grown in this way. So there is a longer backstory, and I think what's important to understand here is that the other parties essentially has created a space for the Sweden Democrats in Swedish politics by, I think, over-investing in this idea of Sweden as a moral superpower, emphasizing things like human rights, relatively open borders with respect to immigration, and under-investing in the traditional social contract that was based much more on the idea of citizens working, paying taxes, earning rights. And so they gave up kind of an older model of Sweden as a nation state, and the voters have punished them for that. And the only party they could turn to for a long time were the Sweden Democrats. So that's sort of the backdrop to where we are today.
And what, in a sense, what have the Sweden Democrats mainly been campaigning on that I think has resonated with voters? What's concerns with regard to law and order and crime and the relationship that has with immigration?
That's absolutely true. I mean, this particular campaign has been completely dominated by the issues around gang violence, high murder rates, disorder in these communities, segregation more broadly. So the debate climate has been focused on the issues that has served the Sweden Democrats very well, along with some of the other parties that are moving more now towards taking on or trying to take over really the positions. And we see that also with the Social Democrats on the other side of the political spectrum here. So there is a general shift. But many voters, of course, also feel if we're going to vote for those positions, we might as well vote for the Sweden Democrats who've held the position for a much longer period of time. So it's a very, very interesting situation. Immigration is a big issue in Sweden, of course. Sweden has some over 20% of its population foreign-born, much more than even the United States at the height of immigration in the late 19th century. So you have to understand, the sort of the just extent, right, of what this has meant to Sweden, and the failures when it comes to integration. Not just in terms of violence or crime, but just, unemployment, not being part of society. These issues are really pressing for a lot of people. As add to that, another issue that has been a big plus for the Sweden Democrats has been the increased urbanization and relative neglect of the countryside in Sweden. So the Sweden Democrats have grown particularly strongly in these rural areas that feel left behind in many, many ways.
It's so important, and this is sort of one of the first electoral demonstrations of people's questions about this. So literally overnight, we've had some significant disturbances in one of our cities called Leicester, between two faiths, between the Hindu people of the Hindu faith and Muslims, and some pretty upsetting, disturbing video footage being on social media, significant numbers of police involved. And again, immigration works when it's on a lawful basis that works for the economy, but there has to be integration. And if there isn't that tolerance and that integration, then that can lead to, genuine anxieties, and sometimes that, that sort of essentially bubbles over. And it sounds like that's what you've been experiencing in Sweden.
Yeah, there is definitely tendencies in this direction. Actually, I think there are 2 points that you're touching upon here. Both are important. The first one is that, the tensions that we see today in Sweden, like in the UK, is not just between, let's say, white Swedes, right, and immigrants. There's a lot more tension, I would say, within the broader immigrant community, right? Conflicts that, sometimes crystallize in different types of gang formations, right? So it's not just simply a majority-minority issue, right? There are tensions within these minorities. The second point that you're bringing up, of course, is that if integration is going to work, it can't just be according to an ideology of multiculturalism, diversity. You have to respect that, of course, but you also have to pay attention to integration in the sense of a common we. Right? That is to say that, diversity is much more productive if there is also a broader context of feeling that we do belong to the same country and belong to the same social contract ultimately, and that there are the same rules, right? What I call civic universalism, right? That we're all treated the same and all expected both to contribute and then also gain access to rights of different sorts within this kind of very elaborate welfare state that we have in Sweden, that is similar to the one in the UK, but perhaps even more expensive. So this kind of balance between what is a taboo word in Sweden, assimilation, and the embrace of diversity, this has not been handled very well in Sweden. And it's going to be very interesting in the future. And I think we should look at the experience of Britain that has a much longer history, of course, of immigration. And there are good lessons, and there is also lessons to be learned that we want to avoid learning too closely in the future.
Look, I think that's right. I think we've got very similar issues. Just hearing some of the language from the leader of the Moderates Party, Mr. Christensen, he's saying that essentially we've had now too much immigration for too long a time, and the integration has been too poor. Remarkable honesty from a senior politician, and the point about lawful immigration is that everybody's got to, in a sense, we've got to feel that it's for the right reasons, and that people are going to integrate and buy into the core values of the respective nation.
Yeah, I think this is right. And Sweden is interesting because we had a period of essentially labor immigration, very large numbers, right, in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and into the 70s. At that time, there was not much debate around these questions. Everybody understood that the people arrived, they got a job the next day. They had to learn the language. They had to follow the laws and the rules of the country. There was nothing, strange about that. Same way I was an immigrant in the United States for 4 years, and when I arrived there in 1970, it was the same kind of logic, right? You apply yourself to try to, learn and understand the society and follow the rules and regulations, the laws and so forth. Even the mores, right? Kind of moral logic underlying the social contract. And that has gotten very confused. And after the 1970s, we turned towards a strictly humanitarian refugee immigration. And then many of those immigrants, they were, no longer, they had no avenue into society through work, right? And work is the key entry in Sweden. And if you're not employed, if you don't have a business, if you're not part of the economy in this way, you are outside of society.
That's right, and then that leads to increased lawlessness and criminal gangs, and with everything that comes with that. Lars, thank you so much for those thoughts. Just finally, do you think this is Lars still there? Just finally, Lars, is this coalition? Do you think it'll hold together, or do you think that it will break up? And does that trigger an earlier election?
It's a very good question, and I think that we don't know yet. There are concerns about the Liberal Party that is probably the weak link here, and that they may be less reliable than the other three parties. So there is a concern, but we've had a long period of uncertainty. So there's a lot of pressures, too, to have some stability here and get reforms through the parliament. So I certainly hope that we don't have the same mess that we've had for the last 4 years, but there certainly is no guarantee.
OK, brilliant. Lars, thank you very much indeed. That's Lars Tregard, who is a Swedish commentator and historian, talking about what's the huge shock going on in Swedish politics, and real concerns about the integration of immigration, issues that we have to be brave enough to talk about here in the UK. Stay with us. Coming up after the break, we'll be taking your calls, your messages, your tweets, and then we'll be talking to Elizabeth Norton, royal historian. Don't go anywhere. It's Tice Talk. It's Talk TV. Welcome back to Tice Talk here on Talk TV. Lots of messages and tweets coming in. One here from Chris, who says, Richard, why do climate scientists and others talk about carbon and not CO2? And they sort of forget to say, you know, what percentage of the atmosphere is made up of CO2? How many people really know that? When I ask people, it's quite interesting. I say, you know, what percentage of CO2 is in the atmosphere? People come up with, oh, I don't know, 5%, 10%, 20%. They're quite shocked when you tell them that it's 0.04 of 1%. To try and sort of visualise that, imagine a glass jar with 1,000 delicious Smarties in it, and then take out half of one Smartie. That's what you're talking about. That's the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. Yes, 50 or 100 years ago, it was about a third of a Smartie. But we're not really talking huge numbers, are we? Anyway, just thought I'd put that out there, and thanks for that message. Chris, we're going to go down to Exeter, where Martin is on the line. Good afternoon, Martin.
Oh, hi, how are you?
I'm good. How are you doing? What's on your mind?
Okay, so I've got practical experience. I run a building company, and one of my clients has had a heat pump installed. So the first thing is, against my advice, by the way, so the first thing is that people talk about installing a heat pump like they're installing a light bulb. It's a massive job. New radiators, new boilers, it's huge. So that's number one. And
Martin, and what sort of house was this was it a very old house? Was it sort of 20, 40, 60 years old?
It was a 1900s house in North London. Totally unsuitable for an air-sourced heat pump system. So she had it installed. It was 20,000 quid.
Wow.
Right. It has two huge units outside, a bit like air conditioning units that you see on the side of buildings, but 4 or 5 times the size, about 7 foot high each. So she had them installed. Now I know quite a bit about this. So a ground source heat pump, for each kilowatt that you put in, you get 5 kilowatts out. And that's fairly constant because the temperature underground hardly changes.
Yes.
For an air source heat pump, you put 1 kilowatt in and you get 3 kilowatts out. That is provided that the difference between internal and external temperature remains the same. That can drop from 1 to 3 to 1 to 2 to 1 to 1 and even go negative.
Depending on the temperatures. And so you had to replace your client's radiators and pipework as well, is that right?
You have to replace everything. And the radiators aren't a bit bigger. They're huge. They're 50% bigger.
Wow. And so we've got a couple of big devices outside. And are they silent or do they make a bit of noise?
Aha. She's currently being taken to court by her neighbour for the noise that they're making.
Oh, my God. What?
They sound like a 747 taking off. And you kind of sit in your house and you can hear these things winding up, a bit like an aeroplane starting on a runway. And then they hum for a bit. Now, here's the kicker for you. Her electricity bill, well, I'll give you 2 kickers. One, it didn't heat the water hot enough. And she had to install an electric water heater to supplement it, which she never had before. And by the way, this is a woman who used to have a £300 a year gas bill. Her electricity bill in the first year, because they weren't set up correctly, in the first month, I beg your pardon, was £1,000.
Oh, my goodness. And was this before the energy prices soared or as part of it?
This was last year.
This is last year, so this is before this. This is, I mean, this is absolutely... And is this a medium-sized house? Is it a large house?
It's a slightly larger than normal, but not a mansion. Conversely, final point, my son, coincidentally, lives in Sweden, and he has a ground source heat pump system.
Yes.
It has a 200-metre borehole, 200 metres, just get your head around that for a minute.
That's a long way down.
That's a long way down. And it's triple insulated, and it's 70 degrees in there when it's minus 20 outside. It's amazing.
So that's great. So the ground source works.
Totally unsuitable for our old housing stock.
Martin, that is a great call. Thank you so much for that. There we are, folks. Anybody else out there got an experience? Have you had a heat pump installed? Have you had a quote? Have you had to have bigger radiators? I want to know. There's Martin. He's a builder. He put one in. And now his client is being sued by the neighbour for the noise. There we are. I'll ask Bob Ward about that next weekend. Anyway, must go now to my next guest, who is Elizabeth Norton, author and royal historian, to talk about state funerals and in a sense, the scale of them, the history of them, because tomorrow's funeral, it feels to me it could be the biggest ever in the world. Elizabeth, a very good afternoon. Thanks for being with me on Tice Talk. Am I right in that assumption that tomorrow could be sort of the biggest state funeral, or is there something bigger?
No, I think you're right. I think it is very likely to be the biggest state funeral.
Fantastic. And when was our last one? Because the Queen Mother and the Duke of Edinburgh's, they weren't state funerals, were they? They were slightly different.
That's right. So state funerals tend to be reserved for the monarch. So the most recent one for a monarch would be George VI, although occasionally very distinguished individuals receive a state funeral. So the most recent state funeral was actually that of Winston Churchill back in 1965. So it's just the monarch and a few very favoured individuals. OK, right. So, I mean, incredibly rare, and obviously the pageantry, the pomp and the ceremony. Tell us a bit about the how long will they have been practising, the rehearsals? How much work goes into something like this, particularly when there hasn't been one for over 50 years, so there's not many people who sort of can remember it? No, so it's a huge undertaking, and plans have been in place for the Queen's funeral since the 1960s, and preparations have been made. It's been decided what will happen, and people begin practicing, obviously not to the extent that they have in recent days, but certainly people know what their role will be. And state funerals have always been incredibly well organised. I mean, even the modern tradition for state funerals goes back to Queen Victoria in 1901, and she actually laid a lot of the groundwork herself, made a lot of the preparations for her own funeral, because of course the previous monarch had died over 60 years before she died.
That's right, and so they've been rehearsing sort of night after night after night. I was fascinated to read about, I mean, obviously the operation was called sort of London Bridge, but many of the troops involved in some of the most important parts of the funeral, they were actually abroad on operations when the sad news came of the Queen passing away. Some were in Canada, some were in Iraq. I mean, the logistics behind this, just huge.
It's absolutely enormous because, of course, they need to get people back for their specific roles. It's logistically, it's enormous, and particularly the number of guests who have come as well. I mean, we've seen over the past few days important world leaders arriving. It's an enormous undertaking. It is primarily organised by the Earl Marshal, the Duke of Norfolk, so I think he's been very, very busy the last few days.
I can imagine he has. I'm not sure he's getting much sleep. And the process of, there are thousands of troops involved, but of course, not just in and around Westminster Abbey, but also at Windsor. So it's like two ceremonies, two funerals at once.
It is, yes. So the Queen's state funeral is actually unusual in that her funeral service is actually taking place at Westminster Abbey, and then she'll have a burial service at Windsor. Previous monarchs over in the 20th century primarily they had their funeral and their burial at Windsor together at the same time. So this actually adds a different element. Going back to Queen Victoria again, very little of her funeral actually took place in London at all. There was just a brief procession between railway stations. But for the Queen, there are big elements both in London and in Windsor.
And the process of getting the dignitaries sort of into Westminster Abbey, and how difficult and sensitive is the seating plan? Who sits where? Who's had a row with who? you know, who can't be in the eye line of who. I mean, you know, this must be the stuff of nightmares.
It's an absolute poison chalice. I do not envy anyone who has to agree this, because, of course, every world leader is incredibly important, and you know it's a mark of their dignity where they sit and how they travel to the funeral. So far as I understand, only Joe Biden has been given permission to travel separately in his own car to the funeral. Everyone else is going on buses, which is very egalitarian.
Is that really the case? I mean, we've heard that. I sort of slightly struggle to believe it. They're going to be sort of slumming it in a bog standard bus, or maybe there's a luxury version.
Well, I mean, I think the buses are quite nice. Certainly members of the royal family over here will travel by bus sometimes to occasions. So I understand it's going to be by bus. I mean, it seems sort of the fairest, I suppose, in that, I mean, it would be a nightmare getting all the cars through for individual world leaders. But, I mean, I do wonder whether some particular world leaders are going to not want to travel on the bus.
Right. And the issue around, you know, some of the diplomatic challenges with countries where, you know, we've got real issues at the moment, the likes of China, who I think they did eventually, their delegation were allowed to go to the lying in state. Do we know whether they're going to be at the funeral itself yet, the Chinese delegation?
My understanding is they're expected, but I think we'll have to see to some extent, because relations obviously are quite tricky. A very wide range of world leaders have been invited. I believe the North Korean ambassador has been invited as well, which can seem quite surprising. But I believe the Chinese delegation is expected.
But is that, I guess, with historic state funerals, is this a moment to try and put those day-to-day diplomatic issues to one side, in favour of showing respect? What's happened historically there?
So state funerals have always attracted world leaders. Queen Victoria's, much of the European royal families were present, and under Edward VII, her son, in 1910, his funeral attracted a number of world leaders. It was one of the biggest gatherings of world heads of state that had hitherto been known. So it's they are really big gatherings. And there's sort of a concept of a working funeral, which is bandied around a little in diplomatic circles. So I suspect that they will be discussing state matters. So
that's an interesting way of putting it. I would call that a sort of a networking opportunity. And that's in parlance, that's okay to you show your respects, but world leaders use it as a networking opportunity.
I think so. I think it's very, very likely. I think it would be difficult to have quite so many world leaders in one space without them carrying out a little bit of business.
Yeah, well, I suspect that's the case. And, of course, our own Prime Minister, Liz Truss, she's been having impromptu meetings with world leaders yesterday, today, and no doubt tomorrow. So probably the biggest funeral ever. Hard to see this ever being outmatched, is it?
I think not. I think she was so respected on the world stage. I mean, I don't think it's going too far to say that the Queen was the most famous person, the world's most recognised person in the entire world. And I think I can't see King Charles, whose reign is not going to match his mother's in length. I can't see his own funeral attracting quite such attention, although it will be a big event. So I think this really will be the biggest funeral that any of us in our lifetimes will see, and probably, for the next century going forward.
Well, plenty for you to study and be aware of. Elizabeth, thank you so much for your thoughts, your views on that. That was Elizabeth Norton joining me on Tice Talk, author and royal historian, the history of state funerals. And you just think about that. So many world leaders. You can just imagine someone just sort of, taking someone to one side and having a bit of chat about this or that problem. Just before we go to the break, I've had a bit of clarification. Richard, I'm no fan of air source heat pump systems, but they do not need to make the same noise as a 747 taking off. They sound like an air conditioning unit and no louder. Well, I guess maybe that depends whether or not they've been installed properly, or depends maybe what make it is. Who knows? Anyway, there we are. Thanks for that. Other messages already. People are looking forward to my interview next weekend with Bob Ward. Richard says, I'll get the popcorn ready for you versus Bob Ward. He's quite the eco-zealot. There we go. Lots to look forward to that. Stay with us. We'll be taking some calls after the break. Before, the amazing Trisha Goddard is here at 1, and then at 4, he's back. Kevin O'Sullivan. You won't want to miss that. And then at 7 o'clock, of course, we've got Mark Saggers. Stay with us. It's Tice Talk. It's Talk TV. Welcome back to Tice Talk, my friends. Loads of other messages coming in. One here from John in Lincolnshire, who says, not to dispute Chris an hour ago, but I was in Svalbard, which is in the Arctic Circle, in Hornsund back in 1998, and they measured 17 degrees centigrade. I think Chris referred to about 7 degrees, and that's in John's report to the RGS, which I think is the Royal Geographic Society. So there we are. Lots of interesting information there. Keith says, the globe's forever spinning, climate will automatically change according to its position in orbit. So much has the ability to repair itself, like the coral reef and the Arctic ice. Keith thinks that scientists tend to slightly over-dramatise a slight change in the norm. I think that's probably an understatement when you see some of the tearful youngsters. But there we are. Let's go to Dorking and see what Crispian thinks of all of this. Crispian, good afternoon. What's on your mind?
Good afternoon. Congratulations on a great show.
Thank you.
I'm phoning about the heat pump thing.
Ah, yes, please. Have you got one?
I have. I'm in a fairly new home in Dorking, and I find the heat pump very expensive to run and not remotely efficient.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Absolutely.
And if I could get a bit dig into the detail, Crispin, because this is really interesting. Roughly how old is your home?
4 or 5 years.
Only 4 or 5 years old?
Yes, it was built. I'm in a block of new builds, and they were all supplied with them.
Right, so it came, and you've been there sort of since then, and
Yes.
so it's expensive to run.
I find.
And other radiators, do they seem a bit larger than normal, or what?
It's built so I don't really see the radiators, but I'm meant to control them by pushing buttons on the wall, and I find it very complicated.
Or maybe you've got underfloor
it never
heating.
seems to be warm when I want it to be.
Is it warm enough or not?
Oh, it's a very comfortable house. Frankly, it's a luxury house.
Right.
But I don't personally feel the heat pump enhances it at all.
How interesting, because we keep hearing that it's the perfect solution for new homes with very good insulation. But you're saying it's still very expensive.
Yes, I find so.
And what about the noise? I mean, is it silent or is it like an air conditioning unit?
It isn't noisy, I have to say that.
It's not noisy, okay.
No.
That's
it's
important.
well installed.
Right, it's well installed.
The build quality is very good.
And how big is it, roughly?
Well, it's a thing at the far end of the garden.
Okay.
You know, I see the bushes swishing from time to time. It's not obtrusive.
Okay. So, well, that's really helpful. So your experience, Crispin, is it's not noisy, but it is expensive.
That is my experience.
Brilliant. Crispin, I'm really grateful. That's fantastic. Very interesting, different experience. That was Crispin in Dorking. He's got a heat pump. It's not noisy, but it's expensive. Could be a bit more expensive with current bills. Anyway, let's head up to East Yorkshire, where Colin's on the line. Hi there, Colin.
Hi there, Richard.
Hi, what's on your mind? Have you got a heat pump?
No, I haven't got a heat pump. What it is, they're building a massive prison up here, which is 1,440 inmates when it's completed. And I'm part of a discussion group who discuss the elements of the prison. And I asked about ground source heat pump being installed in the prison.
Right.
To help keep the cost down.
Yes.
Because they've got 3 areas of football. It's a 50-acre site, so it's a massive site.
Right.
And they've got 3 mini football pitches. And I thought, OK, build some underground heat source in that area. But the reply I got was it's not cost effective. So that's a completely new build. What could keep the bills down for this massive prison, 1,440 inmates, but they said it's not cost effective. If you look on the internet, they talk about a cost effectiveness as ground source heat pumps of about 4 to 1.
Very interesting, but they've decided not to do it.
They decided not to install them because they looked into it and they said it wasn't cost effective. Now, I've not seen the calculations.
No, sure,
you know,
but nevertheless, that is very interesting. Colin, great information. Thank you very much. I'm keen to hear anybody who's got information about heat pumps, air source, ground source. Share it with us. Share the love. Thank you very much. That's Colin from East Yorkshire. We're going to stay up north and head a little bit further north to Gateshead, where Jim is on the line. Good afternoon, Jim. How are you feeling? Are you excited about the arrival of Liz Truss?
Sort of. If she says the inside the tin is what you're seeing on the outside, then yes, it could possibly be a good thing. Finally get things moving and things done.
Right, but I guess that wasn't what you wanted to call about.
No, it was about... first, can I say that I'm a monarchist, and I believe in the monarchy. I'd rather have that than the president. It's just that this has went on for too long, Richard. It's just... I'm going around places that are shut tomorrow. Everywhere's shut tomorrow. Absolutely fine. I work in the court system. The courts are open, which working in a court, you work for the Crown. Yet the courts are open. The magistrates' courts are open tomorrow, so people can be processed and fined, so the state still gets its money.
Interesting. Were the courts open last week, Jim?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's good.
Yeah, they're open, but by its very nature, you're working for the Crown, yet we're the only thing open tomorrow on Newcastle Quay.
That's right. And, of course, they've had to change all the wording, haven't they? All of a sudden now it's His Majesty's Court and Tribunal Service, etc., isn't it?
Oh, yes. There's been a couple of mistakes, but there's bound to be after...
So you think it's got... You're a monarchist, but you think this is sort of 10 days is a bit too much?
It's not so much 10 days. It's like people are on 0-hour contracts and basically being told you can't work tomorrow, so they're taking people from people's house, which irritates us.
That is for sure.
In the reams, I haven't bought a paper for 10 days, and I've actually got news. I've been getting the news what's been happening in this country because there's a situation in Leicester from India in Israel. Because it's a constant blurb.
Constant.
Not being funny. I mean, I appreciate Her Majesty and what you've done for this country and the Commonwealth. But life goes on.
No, it does, and I think the Queen understand. You know, she understood that life has to go on. Jim, great call. Well, the funeral is tomorrow. Thank you for that, Jim, and keep doing well in the court system. Thank you for that. We're going to head down from Gateshead to Cornwall, where Jill is on the line. Hi, Jill.
Hello, Richard. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks. What's on your mind?
Well, listening to the Swedish gentleman earlier talking about immigration or migration and what have you, and then hearing the news about the trouble in Leicester to do with, so-called religious groups fighting and what have you. This is why I'm so cross about our lack of control over illegal migrants coming over. I'm not saying that they're all going to start fights or wars or whatever.
Of course not.
But since this has been happening, the violence in this country has got worse and worse. Knife crime's gone up. People have got guns. I mean, I just think that the government has completely failed us when it comes to taking care of the migration system. And as for us belonging to the European Court of Human Rights, we should just kick them into touch. I'm sorry, but we're not stupid, the people in this country. We don't need to be told by a European court how to treat individuals.
Jill, I'm with you. I think it's an outrage that a judge overseas can essentially stop the will of the democratically elected government in this country.
Well, yes, he's not paying for them, is he? He's not paying for these migrants.
He made an instant decision, and then it takes months to look at it thereafter. Well, it'll be very interesting to see what this new government under Liz Truss, what they do, because I don't think that they're going to get on top of this situation at all until they leave the European Convention on Human Rights. Jill, great call. I'm going to quickly try and get to Alan in Lancashire. Hi, Alan.
Hello.
Hi, what's on your mind?
Well, climate change.
Climate change?
Yeah, simple as that. I think it's a load of old baloney, because I think the world just goes on its own, and it's costed a lot of money for us to change this and that and the other.
But yeah, look, Alan, I get where you're coming from. I mean, do you agree with me that that actually the climate has changed for millions of years? It's always changed.
Of course it has, and it will forever and the day.
Exactly. So why do you think these experts, so-called,